Zealots, thank you for your love and support. I appreciate you all. The West is playing a dangerous legal game in the Sahel, and Professor Franklin Yamson has just exposed the exact mechanism they are using to set the stage for war. Speaking directly from Moscow, Professor Yamson laid bare the reality behind the European Parliament's recent sweeping resolution against Burkina Faso. While mainstream media frames these moves as standard diplomatic critiques of human rights, Nyamsi warns that a much darker strategy is at play. This isn't diplomacy. It is the calculated creation of an international paper trail designed to legitimize future military intervention. To understand the current crisis in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, Nyamsi insists we must look past the media narrative and examine the fundamental principles of international law. First, he exposes the sheer legal absurdity of the European Union passing legislative resolution targeting non-member states. Nyamson points out a basic truth taught in any faculty of law or political science. The European Parliament lacks the mandate, jurisdiction, or competence to legislate the internal affairs of foreign nations.
I want to ask you on what grounds the European Union Parliament from one continent allows itself to enact laws against a sovereign country, Burkina Faso.
This resolution, like several others of the same nature that preceded it, is the confirmation of the abject contempt, the political ignorance that now leads the West in general and the European Union in particular. In no law or political science faculty can one explain to students, here, à cet exercice, I am placing myself first in the position of a professor. One can explain to students that the European Union has the authority to write resolutions on a country that is not a member of the European Union. That is to say, the European Union does not even have the competence to write resolutions on the United States, which is not a member of the European Union, on China, which is not a member of the European Union. And you see the entire Mediterranean Sea there, which must be crossed, cross all of North Africa, Maghreb. There are 6,000 kilometers, between Paris and Ouagadougou. And we see European parliamentarians who assume the right to legislate on what happens 6,000 kilometers from their home, where there is nevertheless a government, a parliament, a people who have a history independent of that of the French people or the European people. So first, it's an epistemological incongruity. We cannot explain it to students in middle school, high school, university. We cannot tell them the European Union, GTP, has the right to make resolutions on Burkina Faso. No one can teach that. No teacher can teach that. There is a second level of appreciation. Why this relentless focus on the countries of the Sahel States Alliance? You understand well that these are the countries that embody the Pan-African Revolution. That is to say, countries that say, we build our policy on three principles. First principle, the principle of sovereignty. Second principle, the principle of freedom to choose our strategic partners. Russia, China, and Iran have freely chosen with whom to align in the world. Third principle, the principle of defending the vital interests of our peoples. You can see that these principles are incompatible with the interests of slave trading, colonial, imperialist, and neo-colonial nations. But there is more. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger irritate the European Union, irritate French neo-colonialism because they are countries that have burst Mariam Pirjo, a fundamental abscess. Who is behind the terrorist organizations attacking Africa? For a long time, it was claimed that Africa was attacked by a particular group of Muslims who wanted to impose a certain type of Islam on all Africans. Extraordinary. The terrorists who are shedding blood in Africa are the greatest massacres of African Muslim populations. How can one impose on Muslims to be Muslims? In fact, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are the vanguard countries, the pioneers of the Pan-African Revolution, because they understood that the terrorist organizations were indeed, in reality, mercenary groups of Western and Middle Eastern imperialism. That is to say, it is the NATO powers that are behind the creation of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State with their Middle Eastern allies, where, as you know very well, the leaders of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State move about freely. So, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, Jida, Vuchubase, and the Niger said, we will never again fight terrorism by relying on the powers that sponsor it. They are resented for this. Finally, there is a third observation on this matter. Why this relentless pursuit and repeated resolutions? There were some against Niger before. Then they move on to Burkina.
Well, that's for sure.
Surely Mali will be next in the coming days. They actually want to create an atmosphere in terms of international law aimed at making it seem like these three countries are factors of disturbance for international peace and security. You know, the United Nations Charter of San Francisco, in its Chapter 7, says that if a country or countries became factors of disturbances to international peace and security, then the major powers of the United Nations would have full freedom to intervene, which is called the right of intervention, to attack these countries to restore governments compatible with international peace and security. The European Union, and notably here France, with its deputy, Major Spook General, Christophe Gomard, they are there to create a precedent for the legitimization, but completely absurd, of European military interventionism against the Sahel. They want to prepare minds for the idea of legitimacy, at least in apparent legality, of a frontal war against the Sahel.
So what is preventing the three AS countries, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, from creating a currency independent of the ZFA franc today?
So, the obstacles to monetary creation have been known for a very long time. The first obstacle is, quite naturally, French neocolonialism. The second obstacle is the African economic bourgeoisies, who have hoarded in CFA francs and need to be reassured about the fate of their savings. The third obstacle, which is obvious, is popular mobilization, popular education for the monetary transition. You don't make a monetary transition just like that overnight with a snap of the fingers. All the actors in the economic system are prepared for this transitional phase. The fourth obstacle is indeed the immediate situation of war. You know very well that a currency needs to be protected to be respected. And it is likely that the introduction, for example, of a currency that would be called the Sahel would immediately be accompanied by the desire, of neo-colonialist and imperialist forces to manipulate this currency and cause inflation and economic sabotage crisis. They had already had such an experience when Guinea, under the great comrade president Ahmed Sékou Touré, decided to leave the CFA franc and create its own currency. Guinea still has its own currency. The French neocolonialists undertook extraordinary sabotage maneuvers. Finally, I think there is a fifth point that is extremely important. This fifth point is that priorities must be set for the new currency to come. What should the priorities be? For now, the priority of the AS countries is security, investment, and the framework. And then I add that from my point of view, the countries of the Sahel States Alliance are already largely moving away from the CFA franc. You know, there are other payment methods.
In what way?
Listen, for example, you can buy anything you want in the world now with gold. You know that this region is the leading gold producer in West Africa. These are countries that have built up incredible gold reserves. They had no gold reserves in 2021 when they came to power in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Today, they have remarkable gold reserves, thus with the ability to participate directly in the international world economy. I am convinced that the leaders of the Sahel States Alliance will act appropriately and fulfill their promise to provide the Sahel region with a sovereign currency. But I would like us to trust their methods, their patience. They showed us this when it was necessary to leave the ECOWAS now. They showed us that when they ended their membership in the International Criminal Court, another scam of so-called international justice that is nothing more than a court of judgment for the persecuted peoples of the Global South, they demonstrated it by creating the investment bank. They showed it by creating the unified army. You say they are working. I know this currency well, and we will hurry to open bank accounts in this Sahel.
So there were very recent lightning visits by the new Beninese president, Romuald Wadani, to Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, even though we know there were tensions between those countries. And this visit did allow for laying the groundwork for a rapprochement and dialogue that did not exist before. Do you think that these recent signs of easing allow for considering a lasting normalization, or is it still a very fragile rapprochement?
Honestly, Mariam Fadijo, I think that President Kosimbuke Romuald Wadani comes to power under extremely difficult conditions for his own country, Benin. Let me present the situation to you. First, he comes to power in an electoral process that was largely biased by his predecessor, who, wanting to secure his position, completely neutralized the process of political pluralism in Benin. First point. So he suffers from slightly wavering legitimacy. Second issue, the geopolitical and geostrategic decisions of his predecessor, President Patrice Talon, led to the collapse of the port of Cotonou on the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this port is the central lung of the Beninese economy, an economy that did not only rely on internal economic activity in Benin, but on import-export with the hinterland countries, and notably the immense northern partner, Niger. So severe economic difficulty with a troubling decline in revenue. Third problem he inherits, the authority of the state was significantly undermined when on December 7th, 2025, Xona Senas, the commander of the Croesta. Africa for 600 years has experienced all forms of abominable aggression. The slave trade is now recognized against the very will of France. It is recognized as the most serious crime ever committed against all humanity. So today, the prevailing mindset in West Africa is a determined combative one. A resilient, persevering, priestly, sacrificial mindset. There is no doubt that France will never again be able to colonize Africans with the spirit that has risen in the Sahel. But what lies behind the French discourse? Once again, it is about creating the conditions for legitimizing, in the eyes of Western opinion, projects of open frontal aggression against regimes that have decided to control their uranium, manganese, gold, cobalt, lithium, etc. They want to attack the AESR. They want to attack it just like you saw the United States of America attack Iran. They want to attack it, and they want to create all the psychological conditions so that it won't be a surprise in their opinion. And they are looking for the alibi, the pretext. What can they do to Burkina Faso because it has broken diplomatic relations? They can do absolutely nothing other than acknowledge that there are no longer diplomatic relations and leave the Burkinabés alone.
The European Union cannot pass binding legal resolution dictating the policy of the United States. It cannot legislate the internal governance of China, yet when it comes to the African continent, European lawmakers routinely arrogate to themselves the right to act as a global Supreme Court. Nyamse reminds his audience of the geography of this arrogance. Paris is separated from Ouagadougou by over 6,000 kilometers, a vast expanse spanning the Mediterranean and the entirety of Maghreb. Africa, within that space, sits Burkina Faso, a sovereign nation with its own government, its own parliament, and its own people, possessing a history completely independent of France or the European bloc. To treat this nation as an administrative subunit subject to European parliamentary oversight is, in Nyamse's words, an act of profound political ignorance and historical contempt. So why is the West so reluctantly focused on generating these resolutions? Why did they target Niger first, move aggressively against Burkina Faso, and why are they now setting their sight on Mali? Professor Nyamse says that The answer lies in the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, a coalition that embodies genuine Pan-African resolution. This alliance has explicitly rejected the traditional neo-colonial architecture of West African geopolitics, choosing instead to ground its statecraft in three uncompromising principles: absolute sovereignty, the unthinkable freedom to choose strategic global partners such as Russia, China, Iran, and the uncompromising defense of vital interests of their own populations. These three principles are fundamentally incompatible with the survival of the imperialists and neo-colonial nations that have drained the Sahel's resources for decades. By independently choosing their strategic alliances, these nations have lensed a massive geopolitical absence, exposing a core contradiction in the global war on terror. For years, the dominant narrative maintained that the Sahel was being attacked exclusively by religious extremists seeking to impose a specific ideological doctrine on African populations. But Nyamsen destroys this narrative. He points out that the TT activities destabilizing the region have consistently been the primary slaughters of local African Muslim populations. He asks a fundamental question: how can an entity claim to be fighting to convert a population by systematically destroying the very people it claims to represent? The truth, as Nyamsen states, is that the vanguard leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger realize that these TT functions operate in reality as mercenary groups directly tied to Western and Middle Eastern imperialist interests. The historical reality is that the geopolitical engineering of NATO powers and their Middle Eastern allies lay the structural groundwork for the rise of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, entities whose leadership, ironically, often moves with immense freedom globally, while their foot soldiers tear apart the social fabric of the global south. The structural crime committed by the Sahel Alliance was simple. They looked at the sponsors of global instability and declared that they will no longer rely on the assonance to put out the fire. They cut ties with the Western military apparatus and began managing their own security. And that brings us to the ultimate purpose of the European resolution exposed by Nyamsen. When the West cannot control a region economically or militarily, it begins to manipulate international law to manufacture a mandate for intervention. Under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, if a country or a group of countries is formally designated as a threat or a disruption to international peace and security, the dominant global powers are granted the legal loophole to bypass traditional sovereignty. This is the pseudo-legal doctrine known as right to interfere. Nyamsen warns that by flooding the international record with parliamentary resolutions condemning Burkina Faso and its neighbors Mali and Niger, European nations, directed heavily by French strategic intelligence figures like General Christopher and Gomat, are actively building a legal archive. They are manufacturing a paper trail of instability. The goal is to slowly condition global public opinion and international bodies to view the Sahel as the lawless zone, threatening global order. Once that narrative is confined into international law, the apparent legality of the frontal military intervention is achieved. This is the calculated geopolitical strategy that Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré has accurately termed the Black Winter. The systematic legal and economic isolation of a region to pave the way for its eventual subjugation. What are your thoughts? Please, if you are new here, you are welcome. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe, hit the notification, and select all. We are the only ones that can set ourselves free. United we stand, divided we fall, and united we keep standing forever and ever. The greatest enemy of the African is mental slavery. So let's decolonize ourselves from mental slavery. Let's keep sharing to educate our brothers and sisters. Together we'll make Africa great for ourselves and for the next generations that are going to come. So that's the latest around the world, in Africa, West Africa, and in AES.